Good evening. I'm Olivier Badeau. I'm full professor at ESCP. I'm a specialist of retailing. I teach retailing for many years, and I'm the academic dean of the ESCP-BearingPoint Chair. And on behalf the president of the chair, Mrs. Elisabeth Denner, who is unfortunately absent tonight, she cannot be with us tonight. Welcome to this event, and above all, thank you to all campuses of ESCP and branches of BearingPoint, which have been highly involved in the organization of this event, and mostly the British teams. Before introducing the topic of today, let me tell you some words about the ESCP BearingPoint Chair. This chair has been created, it's an academic and research chair, and it has been created at ESCP 5 years ago. The objective of the chair is to work on the future of retailing, to analyze the factors of mutation, digital, environment, shopper behaviors, etc., and the impact of these mutations on the formats, the new formats, models, technologies, etc., and so on. The other objective is to identify credible scenarios for the future of the sector and to test, to evaluate them permanently. The chair was firstly supported by the French superstore operator Leclerc. Leclerc is the top one retailer in France. And now the chair is supported by the international consulting firm BearingPoint. BearingPoint is a very important contributor for all the activities of the chair, for research, for all what we do with students in the master programs, but also master theses and PhDs, and for business events like this one of today. Why? Because BearingPoint Company is strongly specialist of retailing. It's a very, very good specialist of retailing with many consultants and experts of the sector and of the various dimensions of the sector, like, for instance, logistics, which is the topic of the day. Logistics and supply chain management, of course, are key processes to make retailers effective. And this is not new, but more than ever, logistics becomes something very, very important, and mainly for all the digital dimension of retailing, e-commerce, drive, click and collect, etc. And urban logistics as well, either for stores and shops downtown, the brick and mortar dimension, but as I mentioned, also for all the digital and phygital commerce. But urban logistics is facing many challenges. Traffic density, remodeling of urban landscapes, laws on energies, environmental adjustments and norms, willingness to pay of the consumers, profitability, and economic constraints. For addressing these issues, today we have tremendous experts, and thank you to them for being with us tonight. First of all, we're going to have Professor Joe Miemczyk, just from ESCP London campus, and to frame the issue. After, we're going to have two managers from BearingPoint, the London branch, Mrs. Laura Morroll, who is senior manager at BearingPoint, and after Mr. Richard Walters, who is manager at BearingPoint. And finally, we're going to have a very, very interesting application of all these issues of urban logistics. And thank you, Mr. Tony Mannix from Clipper Logistics, for being with us tonight. We won't have questions between the presentations. So we're going to have the 4 presentations. This is the tradition of the chair, of all the events and conferences in the chair. And after the presentations, we're going to have questions and answers, and they will be moderated and regulated by our general manager of the chair, Dr. Christelle Fournel. So, dear attendees, enjoy the event and don't hesitate to ask questions. Thank you for coming. And I give now the floor to Professor Joe Miemczyk. The floor, I mean the screen.
Okay, thank you very much, Olivier, for that nice introduction, framing some of the issues already that I'll touch on with my presentation as well. So when Olivier asked if I would contribute to the topic, it piqued my interest. Obviously, being a professor in supply chain management, the whole field of logistics and urban logistics in particular is an important one. We talk a lot about last mile logistics, the problem of reaching final consumers quite a lot in the courses that we teach and the research that we do. Over the last 20 years or so of working as an academic within this area of supply chain management, I've seen a lot of changes, a lot of developments, and a lot of that's been driven very much by technology, of course. But a big strand, a very strong component of the research that I do in particular is really focusing on the impact of sustainability on supply chain management. And so those two themes together over the last 20 years have really, I think, driven many of the developments that we'll talk about probably during this session. And a last point, which I tend to bring in most of my research on the area of supply chain management, is the need for collaboration. And there are many challenges around collaboration, but there are many opportunities for achieving some of the objectives around sustainability, but also on the economic side in terms of putting in place effective logistics systems. Okay, so let me give you a bit of an intro to what I'm going to cover. So obviously, okay, hopefully this works okay, that's fine. So I'm going to cover those three issues briefly, try to link them together. They are sort of interlinked clearly in all strategies related to urban logistics as it is today. I'll very briefly, from an academic's point of view, as we always start out our academic presentations with a few definitions. So I have a few definitions in there for you, and as usual, it's a bit of a confusing picture. But anyway, I'll introduce the topic in terms of definitions, and then I'll get straight into the issue around sustainability, because this is driving a lot of what particularly public actors are thinking about in terms of trying to deal with the challenges related to urban logistics systems. And then I'm going to bring in the topic of technology, which is really the focus for this session, I think. And when we look at the topic of urban logistics 4.0, you might be wondering where 4.0 comes from. Well, it's really stemming from this idea of Industry 4.0, which is a strong topic within the area of operations, strategy, technology management, logistics, supply chain management, etc. So it's really bringing those two fields together. I'll explain a little bit the linkages within that, and then I'll finalize with some comments on the approaches around collaboration in the area of urban logistics today. It's been a topic that's been studied for actually a couple of decades at least, in terms of how to collaborate in order to provide more effective logistics systems. But I'll talk a little bit about some of the particular issues that we're facing today related to that. Okay, so without further ado, I will move straight into the next slide and talk about some aspects related to the definitions of urban logistics. Actually, within the field of supply chain management and logistics in general, there are various topics which are interlinked. So we talk about urban logistics, we also talk about city logistics, obviously linking to the same concepts. I'm not going to go through the details of these presentations. Somebody asked if we'll have the presentations. They'll definitely have the presentations, so I don't intend to read out all the definitions here. So you'll have copies of those afterwards. But I'll point out a couple of important aspects related to the specifics of urban logistics. And obviously, one of the key problems is the fact that we are trying to execute delivery systems within very densely, closely populated areas with a lot of challenges around infrastructure being maybe not up to standard, let's say, in terms of being able to provide perfect processes. Certainly from a supply chain management point of view, getting products into very old cities that have been designed many centuries ago creates a lot of very particular challenges, and especially as the way of transportation has really changed vastly over the last few centuries. Not without some improvements, but that brings with it its own challenges, of course. The second definition I've got in there highlights some other issues related to that. And so we're talking about things like CO2 emissions, which is driving very much transport policy in many areas, many cities around the world. But alongside that, the opportunities to bring together new technologies around smart technologies, intelligent traffic controls, ways of managing containerization to gain greater efficiencies in transportation, and particularly on this issue of vehicle capacity, which clearly, if we can't optimize that, then clearly that has negative impacts on costs and environmental issues. But it's not a new issue in terms of the challenges. I quite like this idea that, in fact, we can sort of trace back the origins of urban logistics and planning for urban logistics all the way back to Julius Caesar in Rome, in fact, and the idea that he actually mandated nighttime transit slots, so nighttime delivery times, to be able to avoid, obviously, the excesses of traffic of people going in and out of the city, to make that more effective. So even back to then, we had policies related to that, and since Augustus in Rome, there's been a very strong set of policies around creating specific logistics areas to make the process as efficient as possible. And I guess we shouldn't be surprised that the Romans came up with that. They're known for their efficient processes, so and we've learned a lot from them. And those cities that may be designed on a Roman footprint, perhaps we've got some opportunities there, but those cities that were not, we've definitely got some issues. Okay, so in terms of the current state of research, I'm going to pick out a few areas which I think are interesting. So this is not by no means an exhaustive review of all the literature in the field. I've sort of had a brief look at some of the recent activities and research projects related to urban logistics, and picked out some of the ones that I thought were quite interesting. So these are more about what I thought are interesting trends and interesting studies going on at the moment, which kind of reflect probably what some of the priorities are today. But certainly most research has really focused very much on the distribution retailer side, so driven actually by retailers to look at optimizing their flows to customers, but relatively less on the shipper and receiver sides, relatively less on other types of logistics systems that are inevitably there within cities, so including consumers, how they actually are part of the logistics system themselves, waste logistics, which is more and more important today when we're having to differentiate waste through recycling and so on. And again, other aspects which are on the rise with things like the online shopping of food, for example, so the restaurant and catering industry really getting into the logistics sector now, as well as the challenges around things like construction. And in terms of the research, it tends to be mainly dominated by Europe. There's no question that the majority of that research over the last 10, 15 years or so has been very much centered around Europe. But of course, each city geography has its own specific issues. Each nation have their own specific issues, and the issue is there's far less research in some of those places where actually there could be some very interesting innovations. I'm thinking of, for example, in Seoul, for example, in South Korea, there's some very interesting innovations going on in terms of logistics, distribution, how consumers can buy, for example, products on their way through on the metro, etc. And in North America, again, completely different challenges just because of the way that cities are designed in those locations. So a lot of challenges in other parts of the world that haven't really been studied as much as we would like. So probably there's opportunities to look at great practices that are happening out there. Anyway, so Let's move on a little bit to some of the areas that I thought were interesting to highlight. So on the sustainability side, there's no question this is driving, as I mentioned already, a lot of the public actor focus on trying to put in place solutions to deal with the urban logistics challenges. And much of that is driven around trying to control, limit air pollution of various types, including CO2 emissions, which is a huge target across Europe, the UK in particular, putting in some very challenging targets around that particular topic. And I'm just putting in this example here. This is actually a landmark case in the UK, really making the link between air pollution, primarily driven by traffic in certain roads in London in particular, and linking that to very sad situation that you can see there in terms of the death of a school child. So the pressure is only going to increase, is only going up, and once we start to see legal landmarks like this happen, we start to see more action being put in place. So we expect that certainly in London in the near term. But around the environmental side, from looking at the sustainability topic overall, there are also a lot of social challenges related to obviously safety and accidents. Again, more and more people being encouraged to cycle, but then again, there is then shared road space between trucks and bicycles, which in London at least is causing around 2,000 deaths a year, including pedestrians. So very serious problems of shared infrastructure and a lot of pressure going on in terms of that. And then on top of that, we've also got very interesting Uberization of many services, which again is bringing in its own challenges around worker rights and how we deal with the people involved in that. And I'll pick up on a couple of those topics a bit later, and obviously links to this idea of online sales, sharing platforms, etc. Okay, so move on swiftly from that one. So I wanted to make the link really between the developments in the area of logistics related to Industry 4.0 and the way that logistics is looking to be transformed by some of these new technologies. Again, I'm not going to go into a great deal of depth here, but the main point really is the ability to leverage digital technologies to be able to optimize flows, particularly within logistics, not just the physical transportation in real time, but also having much more intelligence in terms of the planning processes and being able to optimize flows from a planning point of view. So the technology is definitely there. It's a matter of finding the right strategies to put those in place. And I'll come back to some of those points a little bit later. Alongside that, of course, this year, last year, we've seen a certain acceleration in certain types of technologies driven by the global pandemic that we've faced, and pretty much every city that's seen some kind of lockdown has seen these sorts of trends that we can see here. The ones I put in red are ones that just caught my attention in terms of the potential links here between those trends of online shopping, the digital payment side, the whole area of working remotely, and the other technology in terms of the physical new technologies coming through in terms of robotics and 3D printing and additive manufacturing, those sorts of aspects. And there's a very clear link here between those and the developments which are already happening within what we might call Logistics 4.0. And I just put in there positive or negative feedback mechanism. It's a kind of an open question because we might make the assumption surely that aspects around greater online shopping, robot deliveries are all going to leverage these new technologies. But then again, thinking about what's happening in terms of working remotely, where our workers actually are, could actually see perhaps putting the brakes on some of these developments. So again, a bit of an open question about the direction of travel in those two areas. Okay, so I'm going to drill into a couple of what I think are interesting developments in terms of research. So a lot of research going on in a couple of areas here, which among others, but in a couple of areas here. So the first one is a topic we've been talking quite a lot about in recent years, that we call the physical internet. So apply the idea of interoperability that we have in information systems with the internet and apply that to physical objects, and in particular the physical objects of containers, packaging, etc. And the basic idea here is that if we can standardize the modular shapes and sizes of packaging, it means that we have much more interoperability between transport providers, delivery providers, retailers, manufacturers, etc. So sharing the available capacity of transportation is a lot easier if you can standardize the way that we pack together all our materials and products. And there's been a lot of research looking at how to what the impacts of that might be, and here saying that there's a big positive impact in terms of the reduction of the environmental footprint of urban freight transport in particular. But in a way, this is a bit of a pipe dream, because I'm going to come back to collaboration a little bit later, but for this to happen, everybody needs to agree on exactly the same standards, the same sizes in terms of requirements of packaging, the same conditions, the way that we deal with that, etc. And so, so there's great ideas in terms of theory, but the practical elements of bringing industries together to do that create huge barriers to this happening. But if we have enough dominant players to adopt certain standards in these areas, there's clear opportunities. Another really interesting area, which if you frequent the streets of South London or North London, I'm sure this is happening in a few other cities around Europe, you'll occasionally bump into something like this that you can see. So this little white robot with a kind of a light flag at the top. And this is all around the development of thinking about autonomous vehicles and using autonomous vehicles to do home deliveries of groceries and whatever else you might think of in terms of getting to final customers. Clearly driven by the need to reach end customers in their homes in terms of the last mile delivery aspect. And there's a lot of research being funded by companies developing the technology, as well as pure academic interest, and it's all around things like the capacity of these new vehicles, about whether you can visit more than one home at a time. So containerization, how many containers or compartments, I should say, these vehicles have. So there's a lot of work modeling how and the most effective way of putting in place these types of technologies. And alongside that, there's a realization that there's a huge proliferation of different types of what we might now call micro vehicles. So these autonomous ground vehicles, actually there are many different forms potentially of small vehicles getting to end consumers. Around and classifications around whether they're road or non-road based, whether they're autonomous or not, etc. The extent to which you need a human involved. All the robots that I've seen are all followed by a human, because everybody's worried that somebody's going to steal the contents or actually steal the robot itself. So some interesting experiments, but still a long way from actually operationalizing some of these ideas. And on top of that, of course, then we've got all the other constraints around whether the physical infrastructure is up for it. Walking down the crowded streets of London with everybody with face masks on, I'm not sure we want to be tripping over these robots as well. But anyway, that's another question. Okay, so let's move on a little bit to some related topic areas. I've already touched on the idea, for example, the physical internet requires companies to get together, provide standards, work together, etc. And what I'm getting to here is pretty much all the actions related to urban logistics require a certain level of collaboration, whether that be sharing some kind of urban consolidation center or a logistics hub, or sharing physical transportation trucks, sharing trucks, for example, being sent to retailers and potentially also to end users. But it's not as easy as, well, it's not as easy as it sounds. It's a very difficult thing to put in place, partly because to have impact, you need to maximize the number of players involved who don't always have the same objectives. So aligning those objectives is very challenging. And on the left-hand side there, you can see some of the issues that have been raised about why sometimes these hubs actually fail. And actually, some research that's looked at the last 10, 15 years of examples of these urban consolidation centers many of which never really survive any long-term investment, and you can see some of the reasons why these logistics hubs fail, and a lot of it around misalignment of objectives, as I mentioned already, or really not planning it and providing the strategy in the right place. And in fact, there's a move to sort of think, well, maybe with the opportunities we've got with advanced planning systems, maybe we don't even need a hub at all. If we can think about combining flows in real time and do that in an intelligent way, if we can share, the way that we deal with goods, etc., this idea of sharing standards on packaging, for example, maybe we can just do that without hubs, and that then potentially avoid some of the problems that I'm mentioning there. So I'll move on swiftly to the sort of next part of collaboration, and we're seeing really this trend driven by what we might call the sharing economy, the Uberization of services and processes, and clearly there are opportunities here to leverage big data from a consumer point of view, as well as the advanced planning systems that artificial intelligence, etc., gives us some insights into improving. So I'll move to this idea of actually what we some of my colleagues actually in Paris have done some research specifically on this topic, and it's a pretty hot topic at the moment, called crowd logistics. So the idea that there is out there a whole set of logistics assets being underutilized. So let's use the sharing economy approach, some sort of platform approach, to bring together the utilization of that to maximize the use of these underutilized transportation assets. They could be anything from a bicycle to a moped to a truck to a car, etc., and to try to optimize the flows as well as we can. And probably the most obvious area where this has been sort of applied is what we call the rise of food delivery platforms. So obviously platform providers bringing together independent providers of transport services, pretty much in this case the delivery drivers offering the use of a car, a moped, a bicycle, etc., and using them to provide the outbound last mile logistics part of food delivery from restaurants in particular. And there are many examples of companies that are doing that, and it's becoming quite ubiquitous, especially with the current situation of our pandemic situation in our cities. So as I mentioned before, very much driven by available transportation assets, let's say. In terms of the planning approaches, the way that this is done and is optimized, I'm not sure if we can really say it's optimized, but at least using some what we might call trial and error type algorithms, heuristic algorithms to do the planning of that. So some attempts to try to control the flows and try to make it as efficient as possible, but then facing very many challenges that in fact creating even more barriers to achieving the objectives of urban logistics from a public policy point of view. So things around health and safety, accidents, for example, and the fact that actually there are some holes, let's say, in the training of these providers of logistics services, and other things that I hadn't even thought about. For example, the idea that actually great idea to consolidate the flows. Let's have some shared kitchens. Let's build the economies of scale of some of the kitchens of these restaurants, but that actually then having a negative effect in terms of concentrating traffic flows. So my last kind of data slide, if you like, is this one. It's a bit busy, but the main message, and I think this is very interesting, and I was quite excited when I saw this piece of work being done. So this is by some people at the University of Westminster, as well as other universities, and obviously they've realised it's a real challenge here today. And so the highlight here is really comparing what we might do normally, which is go to a supermarket, buy a week's worth of shopping, cook some food at home, compare that with the meal delivery service that we have today with the likes of Uber Eats and Deliveroo, etc., using different forms of transport. What's the impact when we think about that from an emissions point of view, from a greenhouse gas emissions point of view, and also in terms of congestion, curbside parking, etc. And I was quite surprised to see some of the figures here, but the highlight here, of course, is that if we're looking at particularly delivery by car, so if you're getting your pizza delivered by car or your wonderful falafels delivered by car, you can see here that potentially the impact of that is many times greater than you doing the shopping yourself, assuming you're relatively efficient in the way you do that. So some very interesting statistics coming out about the impacts on that, and clearly, you know, it's a bit of a wild west. I'll come back to this a little bit later, in a moment rather, but there's a desperate need to try to provide a solution to some of these issues within urban centres today, because clearly this is not a fad that's going to go away. I think that a lot of people have become very comfortable with this idea of ordering food in this way. And there are some opportunities, obviously, with new technologies to just simply replace the issues by introducing, you know, electric transportation forms. But of course, there's a cost behind all that, and there's always going to be a significant lead time to transfer the fleet over to a completely new technology. Okay, so I'll stop there with some final questions, open questions, which maybe you'll ask us later, I don't know. But ones that sort of, I think that we're still away from really understanding the impact of. So first one really is about what's the true impact going to be of this change in urban consumption habits from 2021. Some definitely will stay, others, who knows, we're not sure. So some really interesting questions about that. The other question is, there's a huge proliferation in technologies. I just showed you those examples of the delivery robots. There are many examples. Where are we going with this proliferation? Is it just a investor stampede in startups, or is there a real logic behind it? I think there's some questions there to be asked. And then finally, really balancing the externalities that I started off with. How are we really able to bring these together? There are a lot of advances in a lot of the cities that are tackling these problems, but policy very rarely keeps up to speed with technological developments. So there are a lot of challenges related to that point. So I think I'll stop there. I don't want to take up too much time of our great guests as well. And I'm happy to answer questions when we get to the end as well.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you so much for this very stimulating and comprehensive framing of the topic. I think it was very interesting. And I now give the floor to Mrs. Laura Morroll, Senior Manager at BearingPoint London.
Hi, good evening all, and pleased to be with you today. I'm going to begin, and actually that's a really nice segue, Joe, there, following on with a focus on retail and consumer behaviour. These are the topics that really are at the heart of Urban 4.0, and so from my perspective, feel like a good place to start with the customer. So the last year has seen an unprecedented shift in customer behaviour, not least because of lockdown store closures, but also because many of the many workers that have exited the city areas and are spending more time in perhaps their local hometown. So we've certainly seen a shift of where the retail revenue is coming through. Retailers like Primark, with no online presence, have even just this morning come out in the press and said that they reported losing around 1.1 billion sales during the lockdown period. Whilst elsewhere, online retailers have been faced with 4 to 6 years of online growth in the space of just a 6-month period. So operationally, it's really had an impact. And I know Tony's going to touch on that, no doubt, later on. Of course, the question is, and Joe posed it there nicely, is how much of this is going to stick as we go forward? So once lockdown lifts, how many, is this rate of online shopping really going to stay at the same levels as we're seeing? All the research says that it takes 66 days to form a new habit. I didn't know that, but apparently so. And let's face it, we've had 12 months of lockdown. So all the signs indicate that a large proportion, at least, of this online shopping behaviour is going to stay in the way that we interact with retailers. Before the pandemic, you can see on the chart on the left-hand side, experts were projecting a 15 to 20% growth in retail. This is average retail online spend per person for Europe. That we're projecting that was going to increase from about 15 to 20% between 2019 and 2024. Actually, I mean, if we take the UK itself, we've seen a 36% total online retail sales growth for 2020 alone. So you can see that, you know, actually the projections will have seen a certain spike. Sadly, also, we've seen the disappearance of a number of our heritage high street names, Debenhams, we've seen our Arcadia brands, who have been bought up by many of the growing online giants like Boohoo, ASOS, and certainly that's had an impact on our high streets as we start to re-enter them and come out of lockdown. How indeed those high streets and urban centres in general reinvent themselves will be fascinating to watch, and I know that Richard and Tony are going to touch on this with us shortly as well. The reality is that these days, when we're not in lockdown, that is, it's not about stores or online or whether I access a retailer's site through a mobile app or I shop a brand through Instagram. The key for retailers is to meet the consumers where they are. So actually, it's the ultimate in actually where I want it, when I want it, how I want it. It's more important than ever for retailers, therefore, to ensure that they have the stock in the right place, or indeed the agility in their supply chains to be able to respond to demand as it arises. And importantly, that they understand their channel economics in doing so. We work a lot in that area with retailers. On a practical level, providing the customer with more convenient options means more and alternative pickup points, more convenient home delivery slots, and ultimately a greater investment in that last mile delivery. The Economist's latest study picks up on the reasons for customers shopping more and more online. So not just looking at during the pandemic, but in general. And their reports highlight the importance of offering that anywhere, anytime convenience that is a common thread through all of this. And that comes ahead of, as you can see here, avoiding crowds, saving time. And this isn't just the Gen Z and the millennials that are leading this trend. Actually, we're seeing that this is true across all groups of consumers. So you can see on the right the baby boomers, the Gen X actually leading the way with actually this convenience element of I want to shop anywhere and anytime. When we look into customer expectations for the last mile of their delivery, we can see the importance of that choice of delivery slot and real-time updates on delivery whereabouts and timings. Again, emphasising that whole message that the customer really wants to be in the driving seat here. It's becoming more and more demanding of retailers and subsequently the logistics requirements of them. What's interesting to note, though, is the appearance of the eco-efficient delivery that you can see at the bottom here as an emerging expectation. And this really has come in the last couple of years. We've seen this emerging, and we're hearing the same message a lot from our retail clients who are focusing on understanding their own carbon emission levels and are investing in improving their environmental and CSR footprints. Customer expectations of brands in this area have been heightened through the pandemic. And we've certainly seen a far bigger emphasis on community and the way brands represent and contribute and give back to society. According to a 2020 IBM study, a third of consumers simply won't buy again if they lose trust in a brand. And increasingly, there's an expectation that brands do give back to society and invest in sustainable products and business processes, whether that's the product themselves and thinking about the lifespan and reusability of that product, or indeed it's the logistics and the way that the delivery is supplied. Unsurprisingly then, sustainability features in only just second place behind increased delivery options when we look at which areas of last mile delivery will be the most important in the next 3 years. So looking forward, it's clear that this is high on the consumer agenda, with 56% of respondents highlighting the importance of this. Also called out as important features of last mile delivery are smart delivery and electric vehicles, which we're going to hear more about shortly too, I believe. There's certainly an opportunity to improve the last mile delivery experience from customers, as across different countries we see generally low NPS scores for last mile delivery experience. But we are seeing a great deal of investment and innovation and increased emphasis, importantly, and again, I'm sure Tony will talk about this, on the importance of logistics partnerships and carrier businesses in this space, so that going forward we can anticipate significant improvements through the strength of those partnerships. As part of this, new alternative and greener delivery options are appealing to customers, whether that's non-carbon modes of transport, so bike deliveries, electric cars, or even foot and public transport deliveries, through new urban delivery options to reduce road traffic, or the arrival of new disruptive methods. We'll certainly hear more on these areas from Richard and Tony. So let me hand over to my colleague Richard to talk to you about the developments we're seeing in urban logistics.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you. Thank you, Oliver and Joe. Also, it's been fascinating to listen to your introductions. So I'm Richard Walters. I lead the work that we do at BearingPoint in the UK around urban logistics. And I wanted to give you my perspectives on how I see this space. So a 360-degree view, actually, on what urban logistics means and what it incorporates. I undertake quite a lot of work within London. So through my presentation, I'm going to refer to London as a case study. So we can see some of the how some of the theory turns into practical application. So my first statement really is that urban logistics is a really, really exciting area to be working in. You might ask why, and I think there's a few reasons for that. So firstly, it's at the cutting edge of policy agendas. It's really about how modern cities improve their air quality. Secondly, it's one of the biggest challenges of our age. For mature businesses delivering products to their stores, to their customers, or to consumers directly, as we've heard, the economics of delivering goods in the so-called last mile are extremely challenging. And lastly, it's just an amazing space for tech startups and 3PL innovators to jump on new opportunities to develop products and services. And I'll talk more about those later on, and I'm sure Tony will as well. So what really interests me is that urban logistics and mobility is not just about how organizations tactically respond to changing urban circumstances. I actually think it's more important than this. And the subject is a really central element to how cities and urban spaces will evolve in the future. I'm going to flip over to my next slide. I just want to focus your attention actually on the logo in the top right corner. And I wanted to just draw on a couple of elements there. So firstly, you'll see that I've included the word mobility. And you might ask why I've included this. Well, mobility is not in the brief, right? But mobility within the urban context refers to the movement of goods and people, and they're not mutually exclusive of one another. Consider that the road system is shared. I also want to introduce the concept of an ecosystem, an urban logistics ecosystem. And I think there's a number of component parts to that. So firstly, the public sector, which sets policy and influences city systems. Secondly, you've got citizens, so residents and workers, and they have needs and expectations regarding the built environment in which they live and work. You've got business and industry who provide goods and services to customers and consumers and do so within the context of current policies and transport systems. And lastly, you've got technology and digital, which are the real enablers, creating new partnership opportunities around data and new solutions to current and future transport problems. So I'm going to talk a bit more about each of those four areas over the next few slides. So the slide on screen now talks about public bodies. So let's have a think about that. So like most cities, London has a number of public sector organisations who serve the public and define the way the city operates. There's 32 independent local boroughs who have primary responsibility for the governance of their local areas, include schools, waste management, social services, and planning controls. So if you're a retailer, your building will have planning permission attached to it, which are going to carry restrictions around the vehicle type and delivery timings as you fulfill your store. The Greater London Authority, the London Mayor, is actually a strategic body which has some authority over all of those boroughs, particularly on transport policy. And the Greater London Authority, the GLA, set out their strategic goals, and their arm's length organisation, Transport for London, is responsible for the delivery of the strategy. So TfL control and manage public transport in London, the tube network, buses, and importantly, the road and cycle highway system. So there's one more organisation that I want to bring to your attention, and that's the City of London Corporation. You can see their logo there. So they manage the square mile. They're a bit like one of those local authorities, but slightly different. I'm going to refer to them a bit more shortly. So what are the big policies and initiatives, and what does this mean in an urban logistics context? So the overriding goal is to achieve net zero carbon by 2050. That's the goal of central government and the GLA. But the number you see here is 2040, and that's a more aggressive target that the City of London Corporation are looking to achieve. So how do environmental targets translate into transport strategy? And I'm going to quote here the City of London transport strategy. So firstly, prioritise the needs of people walking, make streets more accessible. Secondly, make the most efficient and effective use of street spaces by reducing motor traffic, including the number of delivery and servicing vehicles. 3, eliminate death and serious injury through measures to deliver safer streets and reduce speed. Make cycling safer, that was number 4. And 5 is to improve air quality and reduce noise by enabling switch to zero emission capable vehicles. So I think the big message is that the city are tackling this in a really proactive and multi-dimensional way. But what are the examples, right? So let's think about consolidation centers. So there's a couple of approaches here. Firstly, it's around the development of micro and last mile consolidation centers. The major benefits in the city, in the urban environment, are much less frequent and single replenishment to a last mile consolidation center, which reduces the overall freight vehicle needs in the city. So that leads to safer streets. Secondly, the City of London are pursuing a policy of out-of-town consolidation centres. So they're using planning control to obligate landlords in their commercial property estate that as consolidation centres come on stream, that they use those for the replenishment of office buildings and importantly, also the retail estate, which is at ground level. So another really interesting practical application is around river logistics. So the Thames, the River Thames, is much underutilized resource, primarily for passenger vessels and for heavy bulk freight industry. But there's a really, really big opportunity in the light freight sector where fast and frequent supply chain replenishment is required. There are a plethora of businesses that have their fulfillment centers and regional distribution centers east of the city, downstream within the Thames estuary, that require more efficient access to central London. The river is now seen as an opportunity area to alleviate road congestion on busy arterial routes. We've done, BearingPoint have done loads of work in this space, and it is in fact an area where other European cities such as Paris are probably further ahead. Most cities benefit from a major river, and given that all cities are impacted to some extent by air quality and congestion, I think this is a really, really exciting area. Now, London has got some really unique challenges in its river, in that it has a significant tidal range. So some of the landing sites in central London, for example, are actually dry at some times of the tidal cycle. The river depth and the height between the top of the water and the underside of the bridges is also continually changing. So that's a really big challenge for businesses that want to be able to rely on 24/7 access to riverside logistics infrastructure. So let's consider another group within that ecosystem: residents and workers. Now, I won't dwell too long on this section because Laura's covered many of the angles, but suffice to say that everything that happens is about servicing this group. The City of London Corporation actually benchmarks itself against Paris and New York on a set of indices that measure the city as a place to live and work. People aspire to live in a healthy, safe environment, access to great employment and leisure opportunities, and high quality housing and social care. And the authorities develop policies to deliver that. Now, on a personal basis, what we're seeing is that there's blurred boundaries between leisure, home, and work time. And what does that actually mean for urban logistics? Well, kind of repackaging some of the things Laura said, it means that I might want my shopping delivered to my home, or I might want to collect it at the gym, or indeed have it delivered to my workspace. And I also want the ability to change that option at short notice if my schedule changes. So the challenges for last mile freight are absolutely clear. The diagram at the bottom I have borrowed from a recent study by London School of Economics and Momentum Transport. And this examines the needs for personal mobility solutions such as shared bikes and scooters. And it addresses how the road network needs to change to support these. And increasingly, what it does mean is smart roads, so dedicated at certain times to personal journeys. And the impact, of course, is to reduce the availability of the network for traditional freight vehicles. So moving on, business and industry. What are the big challenges and opportunities for business? So, look, the main challenge is fundamentally around the economics of last mile fulfillment, especially in low margin industry sectors. So historically, supply chains are constructed around a theory of centralization. That's been the dominant trend in terms of the way businesses organize their networks. And these models have evolved in this way to help drive end-to-end supply chain efficiency. So for example, centralization enables better warehousing economics. It increases transport efficiency, particularly in the primary distribution network. And it reduces the cost of inventory holding. And final mile historically has been controllable within the constructs of those economics. Maybe once weekly store fulfillment and a top up later in the week. Excuse me. However, as Laura was talking through, the changing nature of retail in particular and the explosion of e-commerce has just completely changed the game. The result is that weekly store replenishment now needs to take place more frequently. Internet orders are dispatched daily for click and collect purposes. What was once a high efficiency store drop regime is now 6 or 7 day a week store fulfillment delivery programs at much lower volumes, based also on relatively last mile product decisions, which have implications throughout the supply chain in terms of increasing cost and complexity. Congestion is a real problem. So average speeds are falling, less drops per vehicle, less drops per driver shift. These aspects erode efficiency. And road user charging is becoming an increased burden. So in London, this includes the London lorry scheme, the congestion charge, the low emission zone and the ultra low emission zone. But there's also some opportunities, and I've highlighted some logos here for businesses that are changing the way that they work. Firstly, let's take Amazon. So the City of London Corporation have now repurposed one of their underground car parks in the middle of the square mile as a last mile fulfillment centre for Amazon. For the City Corporation and citizens, it directly reduces the amount of traffic, white van traffic on the roads. You'll notice the riverboat service. So this is run by a 3PL business, and they're transporting on behalf of DHL B2B parcel volumes directly between the square mile on the north bank of the Thames and the south bank. This is a daily service, operates once a day, and it's a much quicker alternative than if you undertook the same journey by road. So, moving on to the last part of that ecosystem, what's going on in the tech and digital space. So to me, this is where it gets really interesting. There is so much opportunity for innovation, and I know Tony will talk to you shortly about what Clippers are doing in this space. I think the really exciting part is around new tech solutions that enable businesses to make better last mile fulfillment decisions. So examples include products that enable curbside reservation for freight vehicles, linked to smart routing that optimizes the route to the reserved space. I've highlighted a couple of really interesting players here in Ford Mobility and Grid Smarter Solutions. So back to the ecosystem. So what I predict in the future is that we're going to see in the urban logistics and mobility space is much greater partnerships between the public and the private sector. Many around data partnerships. So many of these early tech solutions actually utilize open source data published by public bodies. But at the moment, they only really scratch the surface in terms of the quantity and quality data that's being used to underpin these solutions, and therefore the insights that can be gained and the value that can be added. The data is, by its very nature, often historic and two-dimensional and not joined up. And the opportunity for the public sector, and we're doing lots of work in this space at the moment, is for local authorities to develop more frequent and consistent approaches to data gathering, such as traffic count data, street pedestrian movements, parking data, waste management data, air quality monitoring, and to be able to join those up and orchestrate that data and package it for tech businesses to use it to enhance their offerings. So let's give you a practical example of that. So in the City of London are at the moment in the process of upgrading their streetlights. So within 2 years, there's going to be 10,000 new streetlights, and each of them are going to be fitted with sensors. Now, at the moment, the sensors only use 5% of their capacity, and that's to collect information on the surrounding light conditions to optimize energy consumption and turn the lights on and off at the optimal times. So what are they going to do with the remaining 95%? So you have the opportunity for a large scale live data gathering network across the square mile, which will be collecting live data around pedestrians, traffic flow, road conditions, and air quality. The challenge and the opportunity is to bring in the necessary connectivity, often based on 5G, and data orchestration and predictive analytics platforms to really drive the value from that data. And our scan of global cities, tech providers, and public and private data partnerships actually show that data sits at the very heart of understanding and improving urban transport and mobility systems. So that was everything I have to say at the moment, and I'm going to hand over to Tony.
Thank you, Laura and Richard, as well, for these very, very comprehensive presentations. And before giving the floor and the screen to Tony, I need to ask Joe to check your emails, please, Joe, for the management of the question after. Thank you. So, Tony, it's now, you now have the screen for this very interesting application on urban logistics.
Good evening, everybody. So what I'm going to do is take you through the practical side of what we've been discussing. My role as Chief Exec of Clipper is really putting some of these things that we've been discussing into practice because our customers are pushing us in that direction. So just a little bit about who we are, just to set the scene. We class ourselves as a retail solutions provider. We don't treat ourselves as a third-party logistics business, principally because everything we do is retail. And we've had lots of exciting things to do in that space for the past few years, so it's kept us very busy. We've now got 55 sites across Europe, around 19 million square feet of space, and we spread from Poland right across into Southern Ireland. And to give you some idea of our business, which pre-2006 was all retail for the high street, we've now grown from at that point 70 million turnover to now about 600 million turnover, but more than 70% of our business now is online. So we are very much in line with what's been discussed so far. And to help you understand what we do, this just gives you a view of it, really. So if you look at the top block, e-fulfillment and returns, they're examples of customers where we run their online activity. We hold their inventory, we fulfill their orders, we handle their returns, and in a lot of cases we do transportation for them as well, which I'll come to shortly. And then we've got certain customers who, because of their scale of business, need dedicated return solutions. So we might not do the fulfillment, but ASOS being a good example, we do their returns both in the UK and in Poland, servicing their UK distribution centre and their German distribution centre. And to give you some idea of scale, in a busy week, that could be 1.5 million units of returns, and we process those on a 24-hour SLA. So we are very, very active. Multi-channel is where we do everything. Retail logistics is where we started, all the way down to transport and other activity. So retail's in our DNA. Right, so really, I want to focus on what we've been discussing this evening. So what does a consolidation centre do for future high street cities and towns, and why are retailers, and therefore why are we, bothered about it? Well, as has been said already this evening, the simple reality is that the current state of the market is that there are multiple ways of delivering stock, and the recipient of those goods isn't necessarily in charge of how it gets to him. So if you've been working from home over the past 12 months because of COVID, and you've had parcels delivered, you've had no say whatsoever who that carrier is, because a retailer decides for you. What that means is you'll get a multitude of different carriers bring your parcels to you based on a relationship the carrier has with that retailer. We do have a view that in the future, it may well be that you as the consumer own the relationship and you tell the retailer who they're going to use, because that actually means that you'll get a single delivery to your house consolidated and you make the decision, not the retailer making the decision for you. But there's limited collaboration that creates congestion at peak times. Utilization of vehicle fill is obviously low, as has been mentioned already. And it's decentralized, and there's no single IT track and trace capability, and there's no holistic view of a city. Where we think ultimately that will go is that we think that the receivers will start to be more in control. There'll be more logic around why consolidation takes sense. There'll be more logic in terms of some of the value-added services that go around that. And I'm going to come to why we think returns is quite key to that a bit later on. We also think that the benefit of a centralised facility for a city centre or areas of a city centre allow for final planning decisions to be made, better use of energy efficient vehicles, less CO2 damaging and so on. And it allows us to optimise. We already do a lot of out-of-hours deliveries. New Look is one of our customers in the UK, and every store is delivered out of hours. We have the keys or alarm codes for every store. We deliver everything when nobody else is there. And that model we see growing. We see more city centres becoming a bit like Disneyland, where you enjoy the space during the day and somebody else does all the work overnight when you're not there. And as can be seen on the right-hand side, you know, there are a number of towns and cities over the past few years who have started to talk about this. And it's interesting when you look at the cities that are most interested, it tends to be the ones where they've got congestion in their quality challenges that are driving that. So who are the stakeholders and who would have a benefit? Well, fundamentally, it's everybody who touches the supply chain. The shipper of the goods is bothered about his perception, his ESG credentials, how's he going to get his inventory to you? The recipient of the goods is equally very important in the process. And as Laura and Richard have said already, increasingly that recipient is now bothered about his personal impact on the environment. And also we've all seen through lockdown the proliferation of white van man. Well, that is completely against government policy. And more white vans lead to congestion, more and more white vans damage the environment in which we operate. And therefore that recipient is going to become quite powerful. Delivery companies are obviously involved. They want to optimize their output and they want to optimize because that increases their profitability. Local authorities and governments, as we've heard from Richard, are very important in the process. And therefore we do believe that from a logistics perspective, the problem with urban consolidation is you're going to go from point A to point C via point B. Whereas in most people, you want to go from A to C. And therefore, without some degree of carrot and stick being in play, you're going to have some degree of challenge to that. You know, the economic model doesn't work on its own. And residents and communities have obviously got a strong role to play as well. So actually, you know, where will we operate and how will we see that making sense? Well, what we've done as a business, you know, as I've said already, we spend our time picking and packing orders and running transport solutions for the high street for retailers, as well as click and collect capability. But we've used our data set and we've done some quite detailed analysis around looking at all of the various attributes of a city in terms of what are the things that are driving the need for change. I live on the outskirts of York in the north of England, and York is fascinating because it's an old Roman city. It fits in with exactly what Professor Joe was talking about. It's got a wall still around it. It was built many, many years ago, and it wasn't designed for a motor car, let alone a commercial vehicle, and it's now heavily driven by tourists. So what the city have done is create a park and ride facility on every major artery into the city, and they're saying that within 2 years they want the city centre to be car-free. Fantastic. But how are you going to service the retail environment? How are you going to service a store? Unless you're going to encourage everyone to now to start to have home delivery and kill retail, how are you going to look after the city centre? So decisions are going to have to be made about how we support cities and how we operate in those spaces. So that methodology allowed us to then start to think about, well, what would we consider to be the real drivers for consolidation? What are we looking at? Well, things again, like Professor Joe said, you know, looking at it from the perspective of, well, should you consolidate in the city or not? Should you procure things differently upstream and consolidate upstream? Should you have a preferred supplier for the city? You know, should that be us or XPO or somebody else? Should you have a particular type of delivery point? What about scale and flexibility and operating parameters and types of vehicles and out of hours? What about the policy objectives for the local authority? What framework will we work within? You know, will it be a statutory instrument which would make life much easier? Or is it going to be local decisions made by local councils? And as Richard said, that could be challenging, certainly in cities like London, where there's lots of players to consider. Who's going to support it financially? Is it going to be a subsidy driven by the fact that you're wanting to promote retail, and therefore is there some changing in the way that we currently charge taxation to stores and how we do have our rating system? Should there actually be some financial incentive based on air quality targets or other factors that drive it differently. And then who are we going to target? Is it retail, offices, schools, healthcare, hospitality, or all of it? And how do you deal with that in terms of clean air zones, and how therefore do you bring it all together? What that led us into then was a discussion around, well, that's fine, but how do we do all of that? The problem with, let's say York again, it is already built. It was built a long time ago. And therefore, if I want to stick a consolidation centre right in the middle of town, A, I'm not going to get planning, and B, there's no space to build it anyway. So actually, where am I going to put it? Am I going to be in town or edge of town? Am I going to convert something that exists already, whether that's an existing building, an existing car park that might not be used if cars are banned, an ex-department store, an underground car park like that has happened with Amazon in central London? And what role would a dark store have to play in this? And I'll come to that shortly. So when you look at it, out of town, well, could a consolidation facility be co-located with a park and ride facility? Logically, you're parking your car there, you then travel into a city centre. Would it make sense for you to pick up your parcels from that point when you return back out of town? Would it make sense for you to be able to shop in town and actually the bus service bring parcels to you to collect later in the day while you're having your lunch in a restaurant in the city centre? So where would that fit within the model? What about unused car parking spaces? Parts of the city that suit a different era to the one we're going to enter. There are plenty of car parks that are going to have to be repurposed if we're going to change the way that we access the city centre. And what about vacant retail space? The city centres are going to be full of property. We've had conversations in the press about repurposing some of that into housing. But the simple reality is there are lots of vacant stores on the high street, and increasingly there are lots of department stores going down the same route. So there is going to be urban property available. So you're looking at converted buildings and department stores. Well, retail is changing. There's the simple reality is people are switching to online. How permanent that's going to be, time will tell. Through lockdown, you've had no option but to fulfill items to home because we've all been locked down and not been able to travel and visit city centres. But how much of that would be permanent? As Laura said, we've seen through our fulfilment customers 400% and 500% uplifts during lockdown. The market has moved forward 4 or 5 years, and everyone's 5-year forecast has been thrown out the window. But where's it going to settle back to? Because what we saw when lockdown was eased with people like Primark were colossal queues, people queuing at 6 a.m. for a 9 o'clock opening, because people like shopping. It's a social activity. And therefore, where will it balance back to? There's no getting away from the fact that the glory days of retail have gone in the traditional sense. But that does open up, as Richard said, new opportunities. There are new entrants coming into the market, and there are new ways of working. And the significant factor for me, as I work for retail supply chain businesses, is people have to remember what retailing is all about. And the first ever management conference that I went on donkeys years ago, I never forgot what I was told. And there was a retail guru there talking about retail. And he asked the audience a question. And the question was, if you walk into a bread shop or a bakery and order a wholemeal loaf and you pay for it, put it in your bag and walk out, what has that baker sold you? And the simple answer is nothing. He's giving you what you asked for. Retail isn't about servicing a need, it's an emotional experience. If we all serviced our need, we'd have 1 pair of shoes and 1 t-shirt and 1 pair of jeans. We don't service need, we service emotion. And a retailer who's got a store, who's actually saying to you, pick up your parcel in my store, and gives you a parcel, and he's making himself a collection point for a parcel, is missing an opportunity. You are in his brand, in his store, and you should sell something. And click and collect and sustainability about that is a real lever for that, which I'm going to come to. But undoubtedly, all of this needs planning policy and local policy changes to make it happen, because some of this isn't easy at the minute. So effectively, looking at department stores, there was a view that potentially a department store of the future might not be what it's been in the past. It might be a hyper-local hub. It might have food and drink and last mile consolidation, a bit of retail, a bit of residential. Debenhams on Oxford Street in London could be all of that, where it used to be a single store. And therefore, how do we get to that place? What's also interesting is the concept, and the mayor's, Paris mayor is big on this, that actually a city centre should be a 15-minute concept. So therefore, can you live your life on foot or bicycle or public transport within 15 minutes? And therefore, how accessible is everything to you? And that is now, you know, evident in Paris, but it's also true in Detroit and Portland, where actually that principle of, can you bring stuff to me? I don't mind doing 15 minutes, but I don't want to spend an hour traveling somewhere. What about the service offering that sits within it? And the service offerings are quite interesting from our perspective. So we, picking up on the points that were made about collaboration, we have always been a collaborative business, and principally because we work in retail. And we have a belief, Benjamin Franklin once said that the only things that are certain are death and taxes. Well, we add a third one, and that is the other certainty is a retail forecast is wrong. And therefore, our view is if you model something based on a retail forecast, it will be incorrect. And if you're building infrastructure for 5 to 10 years, it will be completely incorrect. So our view is that we take someone's base case and we say, actually, let's be really pessimistic. So how much capability do you really need? And then we make them the anchor customer in a shared use facility. And we put around them smaller emerging customers who could soak up that overhead. So we're forcing people to collaborate in shared space. Now that's taken us into being able to do clever things in terms of fulfillment. It also opened up an opportunity for us for click and collect. We are the only provider in the UK running a high street click and collect service for retail, not a parcel carrier. We deliver in a roll cage, so we're getting Professor Joe's optimized model. Parcels go into that, or packages go into that for that particular retail store, and we link the parcels to the cage, and the cage as the optimized unit then gets delivered to our network. We deliver through the back door, not through the front door. We automatically update systems so we can email and text customers, and we provide a 7-day-a-week service. So whatever the cutoff is tonight for John Lewis, Superdry, Urban, a long list, 30 retailers, whatever their cutoff is this evening, we'll guarantee to get the inventory into the hands of their customer by lunchtime tomorrow, 7 days a week. It is better than Amazon Prime, and more importantly, it is supporting the retail brand in their store environment. It's not delivering it to a petrol station or a locker box, which might be convenient, but absolutely doesn't give the retailer a chance to cross-sell and upsell. And more importantly, doesn't deal with the other factor, which is returns. On ladies' fashion returns, and I'll focus on ladies because returns tend to be slightly higher, it's not unusual for 30% of what goes out to come back. If you actually, therefore, can link click and collect with returns and create visibility of that inventory, which we can do at the point of return, we can then actually allocate that inventory to another customer in the network that needs it, making much better use of inventory. You compare that to a normal returns model, i.e. I bought it online, I'm going to take it somewhere, it gets returned back through a carrier network and then released. That normal return cycle is 10 days. We do it in 3, end to end. And that means that the retailer's a week's worth of opportunity to sell at full margin as opposed to going to a season markdown. And around that, we're putting all of the services. And our view is that a lot of these services should sit within consolidation. Because absolutely, if we're able to fulfill into a city centre and then the inventory gets returned out of that city centre, and we could then use predictive analytics, we could say, we've now got a blue t-shirt, and we could send it back to the retailer's fulfillment centre to be put back into stock. Or actually, we know that we haven't got an order yet, but that retailer's going to have an order in the next 3 hours because it's a promotional line or it's a key line for a season change. So all of these elements, we're moving on, allow us then to think about, well, what else could we have? Well, actually, should we start to think about dark stores? One of the things that has become very interesting for us in the past couple of months in conversations with our existing online retailers as well as our traditional retailers is, should we, to support the overall high street, encourage more online activity to be collected in an offline world? So instead of encouraging an ASOS customer to pick up a parcel from a locker box or a petrol station, would it be better being collected from a parcel collection point on the high street? The benefit of that is it services and benefits the wider high street, creating footfall, creating a better environment for retail to grow and to develop, but also creates better value for the economy, because if you're in the city centre, you'll have a coffee, you might go for lunch, you'll do other things, and actually allow you to drop off and pick up products in a different way. Now, the clever bit about that is taking Laura's point about the way that people themselves want to be more environmentally friendly. If I'm doing part of the journey and going somewhere for something, and I'm treating myself with a Costa coffee, actually, I'm actually being more environmentally friendly than relying on someone bringing it to me. So actually, moving products and getting to the end user is quite key. And obviously, we're doing a lot of work at the minute in terms of electric vehicles. We provide a service in central London, which I'll come on to shortly. And we're looking at other things. You know, could we deliver more out of hours? Could we actually do more nighttime deliveries like I do for New Look and some other customers? And therefore, the ability to play with trunking and optimization of multiple retailers getting their volume to a city centre, and then using a last mile decision allows us to collaborate and make much better use of it. And because we look after so many retailers, by definition, we actually get consolidation just by virtue of the fact they're working with us. And that allows us to speak to a city centre in a slightly different way. But we're also looking at other things, you know, bicycles, you know, delivering on a pony and trap, you know, delivering on a skateboard, whatever it could be, we'll look at, because actually, for certain cities, it may well be very appropriate to have a particular type of way of working. It doesn't have to be that we have to standardize it. You know, what would you like us to do? And that even links into delivering by person. You know, could you use a tube network in London or New York or in Paris and actually say, and we do this actually with one of our very expensive customers. We look after Farfetch and Browns, the department store on South Moulton Street. So if Laura ordered a £5,000 handbag and wanted it in the next hour, we would get it there on a moped, or even possibly give it to somebody who walks to her address and takes it. So actually that principle of people themselves becoming a delivery mechanism and using existing infrastructure is something that is also in our thinking. So how's it paid for? You know, Joe's point is absolutely right. This is all good, but someone's got to pay for it. So what we've done is we've had to quantify the impact of it. Where would actually the benefits be? Well, there'll be benefits in terms of operational costs related to the fact that you are grouping more things together. And therefore, like a factory principle, you're doing more things in one place. You could actually look at how you therefore restrict vehicle flows, how you control it overall activity in the city centre. You could look at the impact of that in terms of congestion. You could look at the impact in terms of CO2, and absolutely, as Richard said, with bicycles, the impact on road safety. And all of those are very nice to haves, but still no one's paying for it. You then got to say, well, actually, what could you do that you're doing already that you could try and sell the case for it? Well, we've been running now a service in central London for the Crown Estate since 2008. And it's very anonymous. We don't have a big flag about it, and it was done deliberately by the Crown Estate. And the whole principle was, could we create a facility to service the West End? And we now do 40 locations, 40 retail locations between Tottenham Court Road and Hyde Park, are consolidated through our systems, and we deliver out of hours into that part of the city using electric vehicles. And we are a key member of the zero emission policy of Westminster City Council. And we're now going to look into extending that into non-retail. Could we deliver water and pens and paper and things to office blocks, taking the point about the changing use of planning. So actually we've got some real alive and kicking experience of this. But what we found is that without the financial support of the Crown Estates, it doesn't fly. Because the retailer benefit, you can sell them all sorts of benefits. There's invisible benefits we weren't even thinking of. Retailers get charged a fortune by Westminster Council for cardboard and waste disposal. But we take that back to Enfield and deal with it centrally. So that's a benefit. We can optimize the time of arrival, and that allows them to change their staffing rotas at site level. We can present things retail ready without packaging, without cardboard and other things. So we can be very, very sustainable. But again, you need some funding, or you need a local authority stick to make it happen and get the traction. People who are now talking to us about localized stock and fulfillment, these are recent examples now past 6 months. Even a tobacco business, but not talking to us about tobacco, talking about their vaping products and their high-end sort of new tobacco type products. So we've got lots of people now saying, we are really interested in this. How do we make it happen? So we've been looking at, well, where would you do it? Taking Richard's point, looking at London. Well, actually, you need a number of hubs to service London. You need an area that, so in the modelling there, the green areas, we can access it within 30 minutes by bike or cargo cycle. The red, you can do 30 minutes by foot. We can do certain things with public transport. We can use electric bicycles. And therefore, actually, if you want to cover 90% of central London's retail, you need to be in Mayfair, Shoreditch, Bermondsey and Wandsworth. And that would allow you to service retail, not service the end consumer, but service retail. But actually, out of towns, how do you then look at out of London? How do you get out of that? And we model this on various criteria. We work with Arab Consulting because they're big into town planning, and they helped us with some multi-criteria analysis around how do you start to make some sense of where would you target and why? How would you use the data? How would you assess how to use that? And then how will you put weighting around it? And we created a really detailed model. And what came out of the model was then we overlaid on that, where do we currently deliver to? And where are the bulk of our deliveries going to by county? In the heat map, the closer it is to red, shows you where we're really intensive. And unsurprisingly, there's not a lot in the countryside in Wales because there's not a lot of stores in the countryside in Wales. So actually, you've got delivery locations pre-COVID and also our drop density. And what that allowed us to do was start to overlay all of that on clean air zones and all the other out data and say, actually, if we overlay all that data together, where do we target? And what came out of that was the first cities we should target that ticked every box in our criteria were a number of big cities, unsurprisingly. Birmingham, Glasgow, Manchester, Leeds and Edinburgh. And those cities would allow us to make a massive difference in terms of making sense of, could we prove the concept somewhere outside London? Could we look at actually how would we work with those cities? How could we actually just play around with the degree of park and ride that's available? Could we look at their cycle lanes? What things could we bring to bear to make sense of this subject? So for us, the next steps are quite clear. Where would we go? We know what we'd like to do. We know there's a demand for it. We're a retail solutions provider. It's what we do. And therefore, where do we start with this journey? And interesting, we're head officed in Leeds, so it's probably going to be Leeds because it's just the easiest place to start. How do we create the operating model? How do we commercialize this as well as operate it? What systems processes do we need? If we're opening up ourselves to multiple retailers, some that we don't even treat as customers at the minute, how do we receive their parcels and make sure the right parcel gets to the right customer and provide them added value services in that? So it's a big systemic challenge. But the fundamental for me is absolutely the last one there. How do we encourage the merging of online with offline? We are, as it Nelson or Napoleon said, Napoleon wasn't it, that Britain's a nation of shopkeepers. Well, actually, shopping is a social activity. Very few people like to stay in the room that they live in and have their entire existence there. COVID has proved that. And therefore, if you want to interact and with a brand, and the way I'm saying that, just leave planted in your head, if when you're out of lockdown, you've got the opportunity to walk down Regent Street in London and go into the Apple store, you will find the Apple store full of evangelists about Apple products. And they will convince you that spending £1,000 on one of these wonderful things is a much better idea than buying a mobile phone for £20 from Tesco. And for the vast majority of people, you'll talk to somebody on it, and 99% of its capability you'll never use, because you are bought into the brand values, and you're bought into it by a product evangelist who's a member of store staff. On a screen saying to you, the person who bought this also bought that, doesn't do it for me. And the integration of all of that with store logistics is where we're heading. So in a nutshell, that's me.
Thank you so much, Tony, for this very interesting presentation and very interesting pragmatic application. So it's now time for Q&A, and I give the screen to the General Manager of the chair, Dr. Christelle Fournel. Christelle, it's up to you for the management of the questions, and thank you so much to all, because we have many questions and very rich questions.
Yes, good evening, everyone. And unfortunately, we won't have time to ask every question, but still, let's begin. The first one is the verticalization of logistics building playing a role in a new area of urban logistics? Is it a main issue or more of a growing trend? Who wants to answer?
I'm
Verticalization of logistics.
I'm happy to give a perspective on that, in that I think it's a growing trend, I guess. I think where my experiences in London is that some of the logistics centers that you see traditionally in the likes of Singapore and Hong Kong, so vertical multi-layered logistics center within the urban environment to make the best use of expensive land space. Those sorts of facilities are now beginning to be looked at within London and other European cities. So definitely a one to watch out for.
Okay, and anybody else?
I agree.
No?
Okay, they all agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
A question about drone delivery. So you think the innovations like drone delivery are scalable? This is something the Western world is maybe scared or unprepared. This is the point of view of
So do you want me to answer that? I've got a view on that. My view is, and it fits back again with the earlier comments about standardization. You know, if you're not careful, you'll end up with a drone landing pad on every square inch of your back garden for all the different providers who want to send you a drone. And actually, until we get to a point where the drone is a consolidated solution that delivers multiple details and multiple outlets, I don't see it working in a domestic situation. I see it working if you live in a farm in Aberdeen and therefore you're in the middle of nowhere. I absolutely get that. And I also see drones being extremely beneficial for providing, part distribution and so on to facilities that are out in the sticks to a degree. And also in the healthcare situation, I can see again why drones would have a value. I think in a typical city centre and in urban streets, if we were surrounded by drones flying up and down, I think the perception of being annoyed by sort of insects in the summer would pale into insignificance. So I do think they've got an application. I think the UK is probably less attractive than possibly large areas of land like there is in the US, where effectively you could live in the Midwest quite away from anywhere, and therefore actually drone deliveries make sense. I think in the centre of a big city, I think we'd be legislating against them fairly quickly. Yeah. Is my view.
And what about the delivering robots? Do you think that these robots can be profitable for?
Yeah, well, I think delivery robots again have a view, but again, agreeing with Professor Joe, I think the risk is that you end up with the things getting stolen. I think they'd be very attractive, and also and people just pushing them over, because the principle of them is that they provide a service and they are therefore interesting. But for a young tearaway to push it over and push it into a hedge, I can see it being quite attractive. So I think that they are emerging technology. I don't think they are yet finished. I don't think they're ready for main market, but I can see that actually they will become more mainstream at a point. They become much more mainstream within distribution centers, for example. Robotics in the past 2 years have grown arms and legs. I think externally, I'm still not totally convinced.
We also talk about underground freight metros. What do you think of that?
I think underground actually is interesting, and I think it's interesting because there's a number of solutions like that where you're using underground tubing to get things around, and also using existing. I mean, the idea of could you put extra carriages into the tube network in big cities and move things around. I do think that we're going to have to become a little bit more integrated than we ever have been. Whether it's the river, railways, trains, underground tubes, or whatever it happens to be, some of those technologies are very interesting. And will become features of the future, because I think it's inevitable cities will become more and more, I mentioned it before, a bit like Disney, where everything looks wonderful and calm above the surface, but actually out of hours and beneath the ground, it's probably more chaotic. I just think that's where we'll go, where we'll end up getting to.
Thank you.
Yeah, just picking up on that point from Tony about using underground. If I could just widen that out, I think multimodal. We've already got capacity in place across a number of different, across rail, across the underground in London, on the river, as we talk about, and on the road. And so I get a sense that what people are really looking to do is to exploit the capacity that's already in the network, rather than, or in tandem with looking at new technologies as well. So yeah, it's a really interesting area.
It is, and I think what also happens, and I'm not trying to wave a flag for Clipper here, but it's just the fact of how it happened. I think a lot of things happen because of necessity, and that thing about necessity drives an invention. Well, the simple reality was the only reason why we created our ClickLink network for the high street is because CityLink, a parcel carrier, went bust on Christmas Day about 4 or 5 years ago. And they were a major provider for John Lewis. And the then head of John Lewis rang me on Christmas Day morning and said, I need some help. One of our parcel carriers has gone bust. And we helped him recover that situation. Then uncovered that about 20% of what was in that parcel carrier was click and collect volume going to his own store estate, because he couldn't guarantee through his own transport networks, being John Lewis and Waitrose, to get to every store every day by lunchtime. So parcel carriers were picking up the slack. So I said, well, actually, why couldn't we do that? We run transport for the high street. Well, you've not got sortation systems, and you've not got track and trace, and you've not got a carrier label. Yeah, but that can't be rocket science. And what we created was a trial to prove concept to John Lewis. Within 12 months, they'd signed up their first ever joint venture in 150 years of trade with us. And that network now supports 30 UK retailers and was only created because CityLink went bust. So actually responding to events, just as you're saying, Richard, that we've got infrastructure, but no one's ever looked at it and the way we're going to look at it now. And I think things will just develop probably faster. COVID proved that. The world we live in now has changed beyond all recognition in 12 months.
Okay, thank you. Next question, Christelle.
Yes, we had a question about the same day delivery. Do you think it's just a fad?
Yes.
Yes, I would second that. We've done some quite in-depth research at BearingPoint, and actually that perception that the customer really needs it same day actually was found to be not to be true through real customer insight, and really it was more about certainty and convenience. Exactly. Was what is essentially what customers want at the end of the day.
And you're absolutely right. And I think what's happened is I firmly believe that I've been to lots of conferences in the past 3 years where retailers have talked about what effect is Amazon having. And I think Amazon being a disruptor has convinced the market that same day really matters, when actually, as Laura says, the consumer's not bothered. Yeah. What is really fascinating with the data we've got with the work we do with John Lewis is actually it looks like a premium service, which is saying to the customer, when would you like it? When would you like it is more powerful than you're going to get it in the next 2 hours.
Yeah.
And actually, therefore, that's allowed us to optimize traffic even better. Because if Joe's not going to pick up his parcel till Thursday, why are we doing it next day on Monday morning?
Yeah.
It just creates problems in the store, and it allows us to better optimize the pick well and make sense of the transport process. So actually, I totally agree with Laura. Certainty and the ability for you as a consumer to say what you want is much more important than can I have it the next 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Sainsbury as well has a very interesting flexible system of delivering and also flexible pricing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly right. Yeah,
absolutely. I think we'll see more of that variable pricing element as well. And I think I saw one question come through around, giving consumers the choice of choosing a sustainable delivery or an eco delivery on a longer lead time. I think it's that. I think we'll start to see some more intelligent choices, which on the flip side, from a retailer perspective, then, as Tony says, actually gives you lots more flexibility about how you're going to manage it.
One of the things that we've done within that, which is interesting about sustainability and choice, is we're wrestling at the minute with one of our ladies' fashion brands. What we proved to them is that, let's take using Laura as an example. Laura orders a new dress. So she orders 2 colours and 2 sizes because that's what people do. So she gets 4 dresses delivered to a store. If it's any normal experience at the minute, it goes in a very large pizza box, wrapped in tissue paper with Laura's name on it. So you go into a store, Laura, and the sales assistant say, here's your parcel. So you are automatically going to put it on your arm and take it home. We're saying, actually, through our network, to be very sustainable, why put it in a box at all? Why put any package? Why not just deliver it to the store? The sales assistant then comes out the back and says, here, Laura, I see you've ordered 4 dresses. You've not got 5 minutes to try them on, have you? Because we've just received some fantastic accessories that go with that dress. Now, the beauty of that is it's very sustainable and it's an immediate return. The inventory isn't needed as released, much better for the retailer, much better for the environment, and much better in terms of margin. But more importantly, the ability to interact with the consumer is way better than the simple experience of giving you a box. So actually, the way you deliver is also going to open up all sorts of sustainability opportunities as well.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Yes, how important is the ability of retailers to fulfill orders from all their stores? So to drive low cost, slots, speed, low CO2, etc.
Me or you, Laura?
Let me kick off with it from a working capital perspective. I think from an inventory, because I think actually one of the key questions from retailers that we're working on at the moment is around actually where is the best stocking points, for a product, and actually where is that demand most likely to be at a full price margin, and really that might mean that fulfilling from a store is the opportunity to get that. So very important, I think.
And I think it's very important. I think it does need new technology though, because I think to make it work very effectively, you've got to have a system that allows you to fulfill from store. Yeah. And a lot of retail systems don't necessarily have store visibility linked into their fulfillment systems the same way. And actually probably drives a need for RFID. Because actually one of the big challenges in a store is that there's a size 12 blue dress left on stock in Marks and Spencer's, but no one knows where it is because someone took it off the rail and put it with, the fish fingers, and it's in the wrong place. So actually, where is the inventory? Yeah. But you're absolutely right. The ability to manage and make sense of the most efficient way to fulfill that demand for the retailer's margin to be protected, as well as being CO2 efficient and sustainable and everything else, is really going to drive the decision. Because actually, if it's the last item that's left, the retailer wants to sell it no matter where it is.
It's interesting because in the UK, the fast fashion stores, they perform quite well in the downtown. In France, it's much more difficult because of like Primark, for instance, because of the turnover of all these small trucks all the day, and it doesn't fit to the geography of the city, and it's very difficult for feeding the stores.
Yes. Yeah. And in a way, we've become quite interested with some of our customers now who've moved heavily into RFID, giving them lots of capability they didn't have before. It's giving them lots of ability to see inventory differently, and it's opening up a lot of fulfilled from store capability. Yeah. But it's still more expensive, and potentially, from a staff perspective, means you're losing member of staff from the shop floor to do what you would ordinarily do, unless you're doing it at a time of the day it doesn't matter, or you've got somebody, there's enough volume to justify that role in that way. So it does. I do believe actually that all supply chain has to be viewed in the round of what is the best way to handle it.
Yeah.
Good. Next question.
Yes. We talked about big cities and city centers, but what solution would be applicable to small and mid-sized cities, according to you?
To a certain extent, a lot of this capability would apply in the same way. The reality is you've got to find a way to service a city that provides the city with the environment it wants. What was interesting last summer was when we came out of the summer lockdown, the desire for people to eat in the street, have dinner in the street, spill out into the street, meant that actually streets became suddenly taken over by people and not by vehicles and cars and commercial vehicles. So actually, a lot of this applies, I think. I think the key is collaboration, though. A single retailer on the high street wanting to be different is going to make it very expensive. If the entire street wants to do it, clearly it's different. And therefore, that's why the local authority has to play And therefore, I don't think there's any restriction to size of facility. Now, this would work just as well with the principle of a shopping centre. We're doing some work at the moment with British Land around servicing shopping centres in the same way, where you provide a consolidated service. And one of the things that they're wrestling with, which is fascinating, is the ability to shop a shopping centre with an app, a shopping centre, irrespective of the retailer. So you can wander around and try things on, scan it into your British Land app, and then when you get to the end of it, go to the cinema or go out for dinner, and all of that gets consolidated across all of those retailers into your order and is ready for you when you leave the shopping centre. Now that again sounds fanciful, but isn't. So I don't think the size of a city or a town or a shopping centre really is the problem. It's how do you want to service it.
Joe, your conviction about the smaller cities?
Well, it's around scalability, obviously, and that's exactly what you said. And I mean, the principles are the same. One thing maybe is a concern is around, let's say, competition policy. Because
absolutely.
what we do want is obviously to be able to consolidate as much as we can, but to do that and concentrate the power into very few players is probably a big concern. And the smaller you are, probably to justify the scale, you need to have fewer and fewer players. So I'm wondering maybe there's some barriers around that.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think anything that involves local authorities tends to get embroiled in procurement policy. And at that point, we all want to open a vein and jump off a cliff. That's just the way it is.
Good, Crystal. The two last questions.
Okay. What we need to know now is what is going to be the next industry standard. And so the attendee would like to know your opinion about that.
Next industry standard.
So many standards. You mean
Yeah.
in terms of technologies, how to gather and coordinate all the standards?
I think it's tricky to answer that question without knowing what the focus of the standard is. Is it the footprint of vehicles? Is it the footprint of packaging? I think probably the most important area for standardization is on data. For companies to work together, we need interoperable systems. And so therefore having the ability to share planning systems, I think, is key to that. And again, there's issues over antitrust there as well, of course, in terms of sharing demand data. But having common ways to share that planning data between all the players, for me at least, is probably one of the keys.
And I think linked into that as well, you've also got the concerns around GDPR as well, because a lot of the e-fulfillment data is very specific to a consumer. But what we're wrestling with at the minute in terms of data linked into that is we're trying to share data in terms of trends. We've got a PhD student working with us at the minute on analysing returns data. We'll process here probably about 130 million returns. And what we're trying to forecast for a retailer is seeing immediate trends. So actually the ability to say, Laura, your retailer, I don't know why, but we're getting absolutely ambushed with size 10 returns. Have you got a sizing problem? Or actually, suddenly there's a disproportionate amount of blue coming back. Was that because Kim Kardashian yesterday said that blue's not a nice colour anymore? Or is there some factor that we're not aware of, that you're not aware of, that we can see in the data that could help? And I think you're right, Joe. I think the ability to share data and aggregate data for the benefit of everybody is going to be a real sort of opportunity, I think.
Yeah, and IS interoperability, it's also even a problem, an issue for retailers themselves when they want to develop, to implement cross-channel strategies, even inside the retailers. They have issues with interoperability of the information systems.
Absolutely. That returns information that Tony talks about is gold dust, but actually, even inside of businesses, in many of our clients, it's, the reason coding for returns is really not understood, and it's certainly not fed back up to the, supply negotiation or conversations and so on. So, the opportunity is huge.
There's some real power in there.
Yeah.
Thank you. The last question.
Yes, we have a question about automation. Is automation the only future compared to having workers doing the delivery?
No, I think automation, our view of automation actually is different to a lot of our big competitors. And the reason for that is because we work in a retail world, we know that most of our retail customers are fairly fickle about what they think the future looks like, and therefore making decisions long term is a challenge. And therefore we're always looking at what we call modular solutions. very few of our retail customers could afford to go out and spend 200 or 300 million pounds on a heavily automated fulfillment operation, like say a John Lewis or a bigger supermarket business could. And therefore, we're looking at robotics and automation solutions that support our ability to be more efficient with our people. So that is, at the minute, robotic picking trolleys, racking that is brought to people using small modular robots, technologies that are beneficial to our staff as opposed to replacing all of our staff. But those technologies may well allow us to flex and be our peak support. So less reliance on agency staff and more reliance on robotics that support us, because the benefit of a robot is it's 24 hours a day, providing you can charge it up properly. And there's some really clever technologies now, floor cleaning robots and 40 trucks that put pallets away on their own, and really clever stuff that are not massive investments, and therefore you can justify their expense very quickly. In our world, where our product range is so diverse, I don't think we're from a technology perspective yet. If you look at the myriad of returns we handle, and the types of things we get back, we'd have to have some incredibly efficient machines that make sense of all of that. And therefore, making people more efficient, I think, is where we are heading.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all for your so rich and very rich contributions. Thank you, the attendees, for the numerous and very interesting questions. And thank you to the BearingPoint team and mainly to Lauriane, for the organization and management of this evening. Sorry to leave, but happy to meet again next month with, as you can see on the slide, for the next rendezvous, next meeting. That will be in French, because now the reason is 1 month in French, 1 month in English, from one of the campuses of the ESCP, of the school. And the next topic will be it will be section 3, episode 3, the impact of the pandemic on the retailing sector, on the strategies, on the formats. So thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. Thank you, dear speakers, and see you next month.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye-bye.